Good morning. I'm with Representative C. Allan Egolf of the 86th District, representing Perry County and Franklin County, who was a representative from 1993 to the present 2004. The first question that I want to ask you is about your childhood and how that prepared you for your service in the House.
Well, I had a pretty, I would say, outstanding childhood, being born and raised in Perry County, very rural area, and just a fantastic experience, really. I look back on it, went to a one-room school, and we in the summertime went swimming about every day in a local stream, local creeks, and bike riding wherever we wanted to. Parents didn't have to worry about us, didn't have to worry about crime. In fact, even still, my brother, probably shouldn't say this, but he leaves the key in his car. It's still that way around there. But growing up, working on the farms in the summertime for local farmers, getting a good work ethic from them and from my parents, and I think all that probably, self-reliance in the rural countryside probably prepared me for life in general, I think, very well. And I look back very fondly with that memory.
Now, you had several careers before getting into politics. Can you describe them?
First one was in the Air Force. I went through ROTC at Penn State, went into the Air Force, retired after 23 years. I was an Air Force meteorologist. Actually wanted to fly, but I found out when I went for my first physical, actually for the Navy at that point, and found out I was colorblind. So I didn't know that, but at the time, so that kept me from flying. But went into meteorology and did as much flying as I could and got my own pilot's license and commercial pilot rating. But I had a very, very rewarding career in the Air Force all over the world. And then retired, came back to Perry County and used my experience, my training as a meteorologist, and taught earth science in Carlisle School District for 4.5 years. And then this happened to open up and at the right time, and went in. Never had been in politics before that, but then ran for this office here.
What motivated you to run for office?
Well, it's kind of a funny story. I was not, as I mentioned, was not involved in politics at all, except that in the Air Force and wherever we were in the world, my wife and I felt we should vote, and always did absentee, because I always felt that if you don't vote, you don't have a right really to complain about what is going on in government. So when my predecessor, Representative Noy, announced his retirement, I didn't think a whole lot about it except wondering who was going to run. And a friend of mine, an attorney, mentioned to me, I said, "Why don't you run for that office?" And of course I took it as a joke and just laughed about it. And then a short time later, a local judge, who was a friend of mine, also came to me and said, "You ought to consider running for this job." And so then I really started seriously thinking about it. And it sort of came on to me just like about the voting. I thought, well, here's a great opportunity. I'm not, right now I'm not employed, and at that time, I guess it was right after I was teaching, and I thought, well, I inquired a little bit about it, found out how many hours you got to put in. My predecessor said 80 hours a week, and I thought he was joking at that at the time too. But I thought, well, I don't have children at home, so if I put a lot of time into it, it's not taking away from the family, at least the children, and so I have no reason not to run. So it's probably the same philosophy. I shouldn't, if I'm not willing to do it myself, then I shouldn't complain about whoever does run and make it. So, and then talked to my wife and my grown children, and I got their opinions and told my wife, well, we're in it together, because I know from just observing that if you're in politics and you're in office, certainly you're going to have people that disagree with you. So I thought, I told her, I know what to expect, but you're not going to like probably if you hear bad things about me or hear people complaining. So I want you to be satisfied with this, and I want a decision to be both of us. So we did. We came to the decision to run, that I would.
As a newcomer, what do you recall about your first campaign?
Well, I really dreaded campaigning. In fact, it was right about the time of the check cashing scandal down in Washington, and I thought if I go door to door, and I was advised by a retired senator, he said you got to go door to door and meet the people and to ask for their vote. I thought if I do that, I'm going to get the door slammed in my face. But it was just the opposite, and we started doing that, and people just welcomed us into their home and offered coffee to us, just wanted to talk, and it only had probably one partially negative reception to a person, but everybody it was great, actually a great experience. My wife loved it. Then my brother and his wife went out with us, and they kept asking when can we go again, because they liked it so well. We'd all go to a district. They'd go down one side of the street, and we'd go down the other, and so that was it was a good experience. And
when you came to the House, was there anything that surprised you?
Well, I guess not real surprise. I think I lived long enough and observed government in action. But one of the things that I didn't like was just the spending of money, just taxpayers' money. It was just unbelievable. It's just a waste I could see, not just here in the Capitol, but all through government, I guess, is probably the biggest surprise. But I don't know. I can't recall any other real big surprises.
Do you have a recollection of the swearing-in ceremony?
Very, very impressive. Very impressive. That was, and I think just coming into the House for the first time, observing the magnificent facility we have here, the floor of the House, and the rest of the Capitol, and so that was very impressive and awe-inspiring. I don't know if that would fit into the surprise question, but it just so the whole atmosphere and the way things were run, and just sitting in the House and just observing, and found out, of course, that it's one of the probably top 2 most beautiful capitals in the country, and I certainly can see that. But and then the ceremony that we had for swearing in, and the flowers that were sent by well-wishers, and for others too, just all over the floor of the House. It was beautiful. So anyway, it was very, very nice, and a very nice experience.
As you began your service, did you have some mentors who guided you?
I had advice given by Senator Moore, who was retired, as I mentioned, and living back in Perry County, and others here, I guess, that locally, that from Cumberland County. Now, at that time, I represented part of Cumberland County as well as Franklin and Perry, and so the representatives from Cumberland County, Representative Jerry Naylor and Pat Vance, had been in longer. They hadn't been in for a long time, but they were, had been in 1 or 2 sessions before me, and as well as Senator Mowry, who had part of Perry County. So they all could give me, good advice on different things as I was experiencing. They had already been, through different issues and could talk about it. So yeah, I would say they were ones that I went to if I needed just to get a background on something, and what had been done before, who to go to about particular problems.
You mentioned that one of your issues was on cutting spending. Was that a primary one, or did you have some others as well that constituted your motivation?
Well, family issues were big ones, and just, the growth of government. It's just one of those things that's unnatural. It's just a natural thing that government is just going to continue to grow and get more costly. So that was a big one that I wanted to do whatever I could as one individual down here. But so the spending, the family values issue were the main ones.
In your farewell address, you also mentioned individual freedoms. Can you elaborate on which individual freedoms you were particularly trying to protect and preserve?
Well, I don't know about a particular individual freedoms, but again, it's just the fact that government gets bigger and bigger, and we have more laws all the time, and of course that every law, some some way or another is going to take away some portion of your freedoms. Otherwise, I mean, any law that restricts your activity, of course, takes away freedom. So that was the issue with me there, is just to try to keep government from growing. And so, and along that same line, I always looked when I was ready to vote on something, or somebody came to me and wanted me to introduce legislation, some questions I would ask right away. You know, is it really needed? Because we found there's legislation that other members will call fluff legislation. They'll put it in simply because some constituents want it. And so rather than say, no, this is not practical, or I don't really agree with you, they'll go ahead and put it in, knowing it's not going to go anywhere, and they call it, you know, just fluff legislation. And the other factor is that between 5,000 and 6,000 pieces of legislation are introduced every term. So if that was every one of those became law, we'd be suffocating under governmental law. So those types of things are what I guess motivated me to say, you know, look at these things. What do we really want to do here, and what, you know, is it really necessary? And then what effect will it be on the families? How expensive is it? Is it expensive? What's it going to do for the taxpayer again? Because we have to fund everything by money that people have earned and paid tax on. And is it moral? And what is the long-term effect on a number of things, but primarily individual freedom? So yes, those are the things I looked at.
Well, you were involved in several issues that drew some controversy. One of them, the Sanctity of Marriage Act. Can you speak about how you got involved in that and the process of putting that through?
Well, that was back, you know, in the early mid-90s, and the issue of same-sex marriage. My concern with that was not as the individuals so much that decided they wanted to get married. It was going to be the effect on the family and on children. And there's been a lot of research, and I did a lot of research on this to find research studies that show, you know, the effects of divorce on children, the effects of you know, not having what the mother and father bring to the family, to a marriage, and to the children primarily, and what the effects, and how each one has a different influence on children and the raising of children. So from those aspects of it, I thought it was important that we make sure in Pennsylvania that we keep the traditional marriage and try to strengthen. And that's another thing I always, as I mentioned, what the effect on traditional family is. We seem to be weakening marriages, making it easier to get divorces rather than people trying to work out their problems. And I look at, again, as what is the effect on the children? If it's just two people who have no children, they get divorced, well, it's just between the two of them. But when there's children, they are the ones that are hurt. So all of these things I looked at from the aspect of children and what the effect would be. And so that's why I felt it was very important that we keep the traditional marriage here. And seeing what was happening in other states and the push that some states may legalize same-sex marriage by the full faith and credit clause of the U.S. Constitution could mean if somebody gets married in another state and they come to Pennsylvania, then we have to recognize that. So we needed to preempt that, and that's why I introduced legislation to establish and reaffirm really what had been the long-standing tradition in Pennsylvania, that a marriage between a man and a woman. So that was my motivation.
When that went through, you received some criticism in the press. How did you react to them? What were your relations with the media?
Oh, I guess I just really ignored it because I know what the press does, and generally they're very liberal. And even from my first experience, when I first ran, the one local newspaper, we had to interview the interviewed candidates, and the first question was, "Are you going to be like your predecessor?" They apparently didn't like him, and when they wrote up, they did not endorse me, and then when they wrote it up, they actually started out criticizing my predecessor. So, I mean, they almost had an agenda before I even went in there. So, I just take what papers say with a grain of salt, really.
You also were involved in issues of freedom of the press and expression regarding limiting access to obscene material and child pornography. Can you describe how you got involved in those issues?
Well, there again, I mean, we saw what the internet's doing and how pervasive pornography is on the internet, how easy it is to get into it. And so I thought, in schools and libraries where children, that's where children go, that's where we think should be a safe place for children, especially libraries. Parents go in there, they want to know that their children it's a good family place. And here we have the internet coming in there, and we found out, that it's a place where individuals come in there to get on the computers and go into porn sites, and it's so easy. Plus the fact that the porn sites are so easy for children to get into because they have names that are things that children look at as, things like Bambi, Disney characters. Some of the porn sites use that to get into them, and children can get into them without intending to at all, and they can't get out. They can't even hit the X or close out to get out of it. It just goes into more pictures and so on for them. So it's a real problem, and it's a real problem in libraries. And again, a lot of research was showing this. So again, it was something that in my mind, that we needed to do to protect children. And you can't, as the papers say, and a number of these things, for example, called it censorship. It was not going to be censorship. What we wanted to do was require public libraries and public schools, require them to filter. And it would not be by law that they had to filter, only if they're going to take government money, which almost all the libraries do. And same thing with schools. They're publicly funded. So we didn't figure the taxpayers should be funding this sort of thing. So this was to restrict it only in those venues, and only, and if they did not want to restrict, it was their decision. If they didn't want to put filters on, then they would not get government funding. So it was not censorship as the media called it at first.
There was only one negative vote against that bill in our research, but you did get into a heated debate with the negative vote of Representative Joseph. What do you recall about that debate?
Actually, I can't even recall what her reasonings were, but again, I knew we were on the side of right, so I didn't let it bother me. I mean, you just expect there's going to be you never get 100% on every, just about anything. You're not going to get 100%. So I figured it was pretty good when we only had one negative on it. And so what her reasons were, I don't even recall.
Another constitutional matter that you got involved in was the bills that were called the Patriotism Act by one name or another. Can you describe why that was so important and the controversy about its being overturned?
Again, there was, if you read the papers, they had it wrong. This was not mandating students to say the Pledge of Allegiance. It mandated the schools to offer the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem at the beginning of the school day, every day. It mandated the schools to have a flag in every classroom. But if students wanted to opt out, and it was very clear, and it's been, again, research, it had already been decided by the courts in other states that you could not mandate and require students to say it. So in the legislation I had, they could opt out for personal or religious reasons. But I felt that the school was a place for children to learn. We mandate other courses that they have in school, so all we're doing is mandating that they essentially have a course. In other words, offer the pledge. And it was in already existing legislation, existing law, combined with giving that they should be studying in school civics, the history of our country, the Constitution, what the flag stands for. So it was all intertwined. It was not just the saying the pledge, but they were supposed to be studying all the reasons why the flag is a symbol of our country, why our military men and women fight to uphold those things that this flag stands for, and why it's important. And hopefully they'll learn patriotism from that. You can't force patriotism in somebody. it should be something that they realize themselves after learning about the uniqueness of our country and our great Constitution that we have. Something that was a whole new experiment in government. What our founders meant and why, and what they had experienced that gave them that wisdom, and almost a miracle that we got the Constitution we had and the country that we have, and that we are a different country from every other one in the world. That's what I wanted them to learn, and this is just part of it.
Do you consider those values in decline or a problem?
I do, actually. And again, in researching, and some of the studying I've done in the history, which I like studying history, some of the one of the most popular textbooks, actually, and a number of the textbooks that they use, but even the most popular one has, I think, if I recall now, is like 3 or 4 lines about George Washington, and that's it. And they talk about a number of other things, race relations and so on, which is important. But I think the most important thing they ought to be learning is about our founders and what they went through, why the readings and so on that they had. They had some great advice, and why they thought it was important to have our Bill of Rights, why they thought it was important to have have our balance of powers, the 3 branches of government, and et cetera, without going into all the details. But we need to study that, because when you don't study, don't learn about anything, that's the quickest way to lose it. And we're not doing it in schools. We just are not studying it in many of the schools. And I mean, very little about George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, the other founders. It's just not in the history books anymore.
Those were statewide, even national issues. Were there issues that were particularly important to you for your district?
I don't, not those. Are you saying, were there some issues, or are those particular issues that we just talked about?
No, were there additional issues that were important for you to get through for serving your constituents in your district?
Well, my district was very rural, as I mentioned, so farming is a big part of the industry in the 3 counties that I represented. So I was very interested in agricultural issues, and in fact, one of the bills that I had, which became law, was on the hauling of, we call it nutrients, but it's manure, from one farm area to another place to apply it. We have existing law that says where you can apply it, how much you can apply it, how many acres you have to have for so much for what we call CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations. And so it's a concern with the environment, really. If you put too much manure, too many nutrients on one small area, you can get into the groundwater, it can run off into streams, kill fish, can get into wells and pollute. So that is an issue in our area. So I had a bill that it was supported by just about everyone, farmers, environmentalists, because it just set requirements and restrictions as to where, when you transport manure away from the farm, rather than applying it on your own farm, goes elsewhere, it gets out of, originally it was beyond any control. And so I had a bill to take care of that and to restrict and require certain application methods.
Was there legislation you found more difficult to pass and that you had to either apply pressure or else feel frustrated about its success?
Well, the one that just passed here before, the one we talked about earlier, the filtering of the computers in the libraries and schools, the American Library Association fought that very big. They were very much against it. Didn't surprise me when I found out the person that was really pushing it was a member of the ACLU originally, and she now is in a position at the American Library Association. So I guess it didn't surprise me with her background why she was so set against any filtering, and that's their statement that they put out, was they opposed any restriction of content of any kind to any patron, no matter the age. So they didn't want that at all, and of course that came down to individual libraries. So individual library staff would just regurgitate the policy that came down from the American Library Association. And when I would talk to them and then talk to them individually why they were opposed, they couldn't really tell me, but they were. And so that was, And so at first it was convincing legislators that that there was no good reason that the American Library Association was against this, and why they needed to support it. So that was a battle, and it took quite a while to get it through, but we finally did.
Well, you mentioned this lobbying that occurs. How did you as a legislator deal with the many lobbyists who want to influence and try to persuade you?
Actually, I welcome lobbyists because it's a good way to get information. As I mentioned earlier, we have 5,000 to 6,000 pieces of legislation coming across our desks in every term, and there's no way you can read all that and learn about it. So lobbyists are great because they are concentrating on individual issues, and they come into the office. They can tell me all about why they want it, and sometimes I'll even ask them, well, what's the other side? What's the downside? And they generally tell you. So they're a very good source of information.
Now, you served in the House during 9/11/2001. What do you recall of that crisis and how the House responded?
Well, for one thing, we set up a subcommittee on the committee that I was on, the Veterans Affairs and Emergency Preparedness Committee. They had a subcommittee on Homeland Security, and which then I was the chairman of. And so we went around the state and had hearings from the different aspects, from down in Philadelphia shipyards to containers coming in, and what the threat was there, to the railroads, et cetera, and the response to the hospital how they should be prepared for a terrorist attack. So all those types of things we had hearings on and preparing, and it's being put together a report that we should do as a state in conjunction with the federal government and their Homeland Security.
Do you remember where you were and your personal reaction?
Actually, I was headed to Baltimore that morning and to Johns Hopkins Hospital, where I was going down for to prepare for a prostate operation, and which we got there to the hospital and met with a doctor, and immediately after that they closed down the hospital. People were sending the hospital employees, nurses, and so on home because the schools were letting their children out, and so that was very vivid in my mind at the time, and the effect and what was happening in shutting down the schools, and we didn't get the full report, of course, until later.
In your 12 years of service, were there other moments that you thought constituted crises or emergencies in the state?
Well, I can't recall of any at this point.
How about the medical malpractice?
Well,
what was called a crisis or a state of emergency in the state?
I guess I wouldn't call it a state of emergency, at least in my mind, my definition of an emergency. But certainly, I think it has reached almost a crisis stage. It's, in fact, I've maintained early on that the only way we're going to change the problem there, to change the problem of having so many lawsuits, frivolous lawsuits, very expensive lawsuits against doctors. The only way we're going to change it is to have a crisis where people see their own physicians leaving, going out of practice, and that's what happened. So I guess we've reached that crisis, and we did finally get some legislation done here in Pennsylvania. Not enough. I guess it's going to have to get even worse. We did a number of things. I won't go into them unless you'd like to hear about it. But one we didn't do was putting caps on the non-economical damages, and so that's an area that we still need to work on, because we're seeing the doctors, of course, their insurance is just going up, and that's driving them out of the state, and people are seeing their doctors leave. So.
At this point, I'd like to show you some photographs and to describe your involvement in outreach as well as some of the issues that are involved. The first one, if that's up, shows you at Fort Indian Town Gap. And I wonder if you can describe your involvement and why this was important to you and how you became involved.
I guess this was the one on the dedication of the Veterans Memorial. And that's at Fort Indian Town Gap has a national cemetery there. And so Pennsylvania wanted to, and had been working for years, to get a memorial there for the veterans. And so we finally, it was a matter of raising the money, and at one point they had actually gone out and asked the voters to vote on a bond issue. It really wasn't stated well, and I think people misunderstood it. It said about going into debt, and so it was voted down. So the different veterans groups had worked for a number of years to try to raise the money, and we did get some state money to go along with it. And I don't remember the exact cost, but it was in the millions to do this, and we finally did. So I think it's a big plus for Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has historically been about the #1 state, or very close to it, in providing veterans, members for the military in the different wars that we've had. So we've been very, very supportive in the defense of our country. And so it was important to the Pennsylvania veterans to have this, and to have the memorial for their service and their sacrifices. And so I was glad to be a part of that.
You've been honored for your service on behalf of veterans. Do you think that not enough people are involved in this effort?
In what, in the defense of our country you're talking about, or in
Veterans Affairs? You
well,
have been quoted about benefits for veterans and them.
When we went away from the draft, and depending on a volunteer force, I guess the number of veterans in the House of Representatives and Senate, I think, has gone down. I don't know the figures, but there are very few veterans anymore in the legislature. So, and since I had a career in the Air Force, I feel strongly again about the sacrifices and the necessity of our, of having a strong military. And then the people that volunteer to do that, and the sacrifices that they and their families go through, moving constantly, having separated assignments, what we call remote assignments, where one member of the family is gone in a remote region, their family's back home. So sacrifices that probably the general population doesn't see or realize. And so I think anything we can do for those veterans and to show our appreciation as citizens for that, we should do.
A second picture that I have shows you with a car in the Capitol. Can you describe what this event is and what the background is?
This was a car that a retired policeman actually built. And it talks, and it moves by remote control, and it looks like it's going to crash and do things, different things to get the kids' interest. And he takes it around to schools and places where he can bring the children in, and he'll have somebody standing back somewhere unseen with a microphone, and they can, and also can hear the children. Children will ask the car questions, and they can then talk to them. And the idea, though, is to promote safe driving, which specifically goes to non-drinking, and they want to instill in the children the effects of alcohol and drunk driving. And my interest in it was that I've had a bill in for a long time to reduce the amount of blood alcohol that it takes to declare someone as being drunk, DUI, driving under the influence. And we had a hard time getting that through the legislature for, I don't know, various reasons. I could give, I guess, some, what I think the problem was. The legislators just didn't want to vote on it. But finally, we actually got mandated by the federal government to lower the blood alcohol content. So I was then put on a task force to look into it, try to get a good bill, good legislation, which we did, I think, for Pennsylvania, to comply with the federal government requirement and to do the job here.
Was that a particularly tough legislation to get?
Not once we got the task force. Once we had the hammer from the federal government, which I don't necessarily like. I don't like, I believe in the 10th Amendment, that states' rights, and we should do it as a state and not do it because the federal government doesn't have any business getting into the state's business. What they do is they'll withhold funding, and it's sort of like legalized extortion, I guess, and they say, you do this or we'll withhold transportation money from you. Well, in any case, that got the leadership's attention, so they said, well, we've got to do something, and so they formed this task force, and I was on it, and so that's why we got it through. So it was, by that point, then it wasn't hard to get done. It passed, I think, pretty easily then once we got the legislation introduced.
And a third photograph shows you hard at work at a house. Can you explain what this was about?
Well, that was what we called the house that the House built for Habitat for Humanity. The Speaker of the House, I guess, got the inspiration to do this, to build a house or apartments here locally in Harrisburg and ask members of the House to donate their time, and that's what we were doing there. In that picture, we all donated whatever time we could afford, and went out there and actually got to work. We had professional builders there telling us, and guiding us what to do, and we built a couple of houses there that under the Habitat for Humanity. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where the individual owners have to give some sweat equity, but we all had a good time, legislators.
Well, this leads me to ask about the representative as a public figure. You had been a private citizen in these various activities. Was that an adjustment for you to be in the public limelight, to do these kinds of outreach?
Well, I suppose early on it was probably the biggest thing was speaking to different groups. So I sort of got very used to that very quickly, speaking to different groups, whether it was the Lions Club or the farmers or whatever groups, Scouts. I've supported the Scouts very strongly, Eagle Scouts, give them citations, and so on. So speaking probably was the biggest adjustment, but then you adjust very quickly, and going to things like this, the Habitat, that wasn't, that was, we were just working with fellow House members there, and not really in the public's eye. I don't even know that very many of them knew we were doing it.
Reflecting on your 12 years of service, what do you think are the biggest changes that occurred?
The biggest changes in the House?
House.
Well, of course, we had leadership changes. The biggest change was from the first session when I came in 93, 94, our party was in the minority. And then the next term we got the majority, and it was very close. We had, I think, majority by one person, but it's been increasing since then. And so that was the biggest change, going into the majority and being able to get legislation that we wanted passed, getting it done.
And in the House, is the party structure with the majority and minority make a big difference?
Oh, yes.
Experience?
Yeah, it does. Well, it does, because the majority party assigns all the chairmanships of the committees, and the committees are where the work is really done, and holding hearings, voting on, deciding which piece of legislation to come up for a vote, and that varies with committees. Some chairmen will allow all legislation that's assigned to their committee to come up for a vote. Other ones don't. They pick and choose. But also the number of members on the committee. The majority party gets more members on a committee than the minority. So right there you generally have more votes, although it's not always, in fact, quite often it's not on party line. A lot of people think it's strictly party line voting, and there's great partisanship, but it's not. It's very bipartisan down here, I think. But still, it definitely makes a difference as who is in control.
How about the seniority system? Did you feel you had more power after 10 years?
Oh yeah, I think, well, for various reasons. I mean, first of all, of course, chairmanships of the committees are based on seniority. And now I'm not here long enough, it would have to be another term or two before I would be up for a chairmanship, although I had vice chairmanship of the Veterans Affairs Emergency Preparedness Committee, and then chairmanship of a subcommittee. So part of that was based on my background, military background, and part on seniority. But seniority certainly plays a part, and just the fact of being here longer and having experience makes a difference also. It just in general, and getting known, and people know where you stand and whether they can depend on you or not, and just what your philosophy is and so on. So that all adds to it. Certainly.
Reflecting on your service, what do you consider your greatest accomplishments?
Here in the House, probably, well, the number of the bills, the last one I mentioned earlier on the internet filtering, I thought that was one of the biggest. My first bill came through. It was because of child abuse ending in the death of a child, and I doubled the penalties for that. I don't know how if significant it is as far as preventing child abuse, because many times that sort of thing, the perpetrators don't even look at what the penalty is going to be. So I don't know how significant that one is, but I did want to get that through, and so probably the internet filtering was probably the biggest accomplishment.
What are your greatest frustrations or disappointments in your service?
Well, frustration is just the time it takes and the effort to get legislation through. However, on the other hand, I always have to remind myself that's good. That was designed into it by founders. They don't want legislation just to go through willy-nilly and with great speed. That's why we have the system we have. And when I go out to schools and talk to the kids, I tell them that it's very frustrating when there's legislation you want to get through, but on the other hand, it's also very good because otherwise we would get frivolous legislation. And so I guess it's both frustrating but also satisfying.
Why did you decide not to return to the House?
Primarily because of my family. My issues that I mentioned was mostly family oriented, and my grandchildren are growing, and 2 or 3 years makes a big difference in their lives. It's not very long in mine, but to them they change significantly, and I just didn't want to. I thought now I need to do it now, or it wouldn't really matter that much, because I would probably reach the point and say, well, I should have retired earlier because the kids are grown and gone now. And the big thing is they live very close to us. If they were in California, it probably wouldn't have made a difference, but they're right here. They were within a half mile of where we live, so I wanted to be with them and have time with them. And they're just, in this job, to do it right, you don't have very much time for yourself and for your family. So that was my reason for deciding now.
At your farewell address, you singled out the support of your wife in your 12 years. Was she also involved in political discussions or with your? Primarily,
she went with me a lot of places we go, and she likes to meet people, and so when we went to Franklin County to whether it was the annual Farm Bureau banquet, or whether it was a Ruritan Club meeting, we had many functions like that. And I really wanted to support those kind of functions in the local communities. And she usually went with me. She, if she could at all possible, she teaches piano at home, and she would, when she take on students, she would let them know that, we may have to change the schedule. We may have to cancel or reschedule your piano lessons. And and she did that, and I felt it was a sacrifice. But she traveled with me. That's really where we talked about a lot of things. Was on our travels to meetings, maybe across the county, and because again, there's just things going on every day, every evening, practically. So I wouldn't see her very much if she didn't go with me to those types of activities.
And if you had advice for the new representatives coming in, what would it be?
My advice would be to set standards like I did, so you have guidance as to what you do, and weigh every piece of legislation you're voting on, how it's going to meet those, and the way you vote is going to meet those standards you've set, those principles. And it makes it so easy. It just has not been hard for me at all, because I look and say, well, does it meet these standards? If it does, I vote for it. If it doesn't, I vote against it. And many times, there's many pressures here. There's many pressures to compromise, to vote for something, to get something for you, maybe back in your district, some help on a road project or whatever it may be, or some funding for something. And once you compromise, then it's going to be very difficult ever to say, no, I can't do it based on principle, or I can't do it because of my constituents. Because then the argument, well, if you want to get something for constituents, then you vote for this even though you don't think it's right maybe in the long term for your constituents. So those are the type, I think that has made it so easy. It's so easy to make decisions. And that's what my advice would be to a new person coming in. Set those standards, stay with them.
Will you stay involved in politics in retirement?
I don't think be very much involved. I will be stay aware of what's happening here, but I mean, I'm not sure what you mean as far as being involved, but